December 18th, 2022, a United Airlines Boeing 777 lifts off for Maui's Kahului Airport, headed for San Francisco. Minutes after taking off, something goes terribly wrong. With over 270 passengers on board, the giant aircraft begins an unexpected descent, driving rapidly towards the ocean below. What triggered this life-threatening dive? And will the pilots manage to recover the massive aircraft in time? This is the story of United Airlines Flight 1722's dangerous journey from Hawaii to San Francisco in December 2022. United Airlines Flight 1722 was scheduled to depart in the afternoon of December 18, 2022, from Maui's Kahului Airport in Hawaii, bound for San Francisco. It was supposed to be a routine 5-hour flight across the Pacific, but the weather conditions were anything but ordinary. A powerful winter storm has been confirmed moving across the Hawaiian Islands, bringing heavy rain, gusty winds, and the threat of low-level wind shear, which is a dangerous phenomenon where the wind's speed or direction shifts sharply over a short distance, creating a potential hazard for departing aircraft. The captain of this flight, an experienced 55-year-old pilot with nearly 20,000 flight hours, was aware of the challenging conditions and took them seriously. He had flown the Boeing 777 for years, but much of his experience was as a first officer rather than as captain. The first officer for this flight was also new to United Airlines and had around 5,300 flight hours across his career. So yeah, he was also still adjusting to the Boeing 777, with just over 100 hours on this type of aircraft. Just minutes before the aircraft was approved for pushback and engine start, the captain, as they prepared for takeoff, the captain received a briefing from the dispatcher on the severe weather. Moments later, the first officer, again, received a text from a friend warning that a Hawaiian Airlines flight had encountered severe turbulence in the same area earlier that day, leading to the injuries of 36 people, including a 1-year-old and 3 crew members. With this in mind, the captain decided to adjust their takeoff configuration, using an extra notch of flaps and full thrust to ensure additional lift for takeoff, so they could win against the bad weather conditions. What they couldn't have anticipated, however, was how this decision would set in motion a series of small yet critical errors that would soon push the flight to the brink of disaster. As Flight 1722's pilots arrived at the airport, they were already on high alert. Both the captain and first officer were briefed by the dispatcher on the storm system moving across the Hawaiian Islands, which carried the risk of severe turbulence and low-level wind shear. During the external inspection, the first officer reviewed the aircraft's exterior amid heavy rain and gusty winds, noting nothing unusual but fully aware of the challenging conditions. He shared the recent turbulence report with the captain, confirming that they needed to be vigilant. Given the weather warnings, the captain decided on a less common takeoff configuration. Instead of the usual flap setting of 15 degrees, he opted for flap 20, which would allow the aircraft to maintain a lower speed if they encountered wind shear shortly after takeoff. He also chose to use full thrust rather than the usual reduced power setting, giving them maximum power for a safe climb out of Kahului. Or so they thought. Flight 1722 taxied through the heavy rain towards runway 2. As the aircraft lined up on the runway, the captain ran through the final checks, activating the windshield wipers to high and setting the weather radar to scan the storm cells ahead. With everything in place, they received takeoff clearance, and the captain pushed the engines to full thrust, unleashing the immense power of the Boeing 777. The initial climb was smooth, but as they began to ascend, the effects of the turbulent air quickly became apparent. The airspeed began to fluctuate, a clear signal of unstable conditions outside. However, the captain was fully prepared for the possibility of wind shear and had briefed the first officer on an escape maneuver should they encounter it. So yeah, there wasn't really anything extraordinary to worry about. As the aircraft climbed, the captain lowered the nose slightly to build up speed. This was routine, especially since the extra lift from the flaps was no longer needed at a higher altitude. To achieve this, the captain called for flaps 5, intending to retract from the flaps 20 directly to 5, per Boeing's instructions for this configuration. But in the cockpit, unfortunately, the first officer, who had limited experience on the 777, thought he heard flaps 15. Without double checking, trusting the instructions of the first officer, he moved the flaps to 15, interrupting the intended sequence and creating a critical misalignment between the captain's expectation and the plane's actual configuration. In the cockpit, neither pilot realized the impact of this miscommunication. Focused on the storm and the potential for wind shear, both were unaware that this small error was about to take their flight on a rapid descent toward the Pacific Ocean. As Flight 1722 climbed through 1,400 feet, the captain noticed something unusual. The aircraft was accelerating more quickly than expected. Almost immediately, the overspeed warning began to flash on his display, indicating they were nearing the maximum safe speed for the current flap setting. The captain instinctively reduced engine thrust slightly to avoid overspeeding, but although overspeeding was temporarily reduced, that action caused the plane's nose to dip forward. What the captain didn't realize was that the flaps had not been retracted as he intended. Instead of being at flap 5, they were set at flap 15. In the turbulent conditions, the reduced thrust created a downward pitch, which would have been manageable if they had noticed and corrected it. But focused on resolving the overspeed and unaware of the flap misalignment, the captain's attention was drawn away from the primary flight display. Unfortunately, in those few critical moments, the nose of the Boeing 777 continued to dip. As the descent steepened, the ground proximity warning system blared in the cockpit, signaling that they were approaching dangerous terrain. The captain glanced at his instruments, only now realizing the aircraft was in a rapid descent. At that time, the aircraft was already traveling downward at over 8,000 feet per minute, bringing them closer to the ocean below with each passing second. Meanwhile, the first officer was struggling to understand what was happening. He saw the altitude dropping and heard the warnings. He couldn't make sense of the rapid descent, and in the next few seconds, they would either recover the aircraft or face catastrophe. The alarms continued to sound as the ocean approached them even faster. Somehow, the first officer looked outside the cockpit windows yet again, only to realize the aircraft was only a few seconds from the water. This confirmed that they were indeed in a steep dive. He called out urgently to the captain, breaking the captain's focus on the overspeed warning and directing his attention to the immediate danger. Responding immediately, the captain pulled back sharply on the control column, working against the powerful forces driving the aircraft downward. He simultaneously pushed the engines to maximum thrust, executing an emergency terrain escape maneuver designed to help the plane recover altitude as quickly as possible. The passengers, still unaware of the exact danger they were in, felt the intense G-forces pressing them back into their seats as the Boeing 777 leveled out and began climbing. Inside the cockpit, the captain and first officer watched the altitude indicators rise, and they were no longer at risk of crashing into the ocean. To put things into context, the entire ordeal, right from the first signal of an issue till the aircraft began to ascend, lasted only 45 seconds. And during that time, the lowest recorded altitude during the incident was a mere 748 feet above the ocean. Once the aircraft had stabilized, the captain contacted the purser to ensure that everyone in the cabin was safe and that there were no injuries. Fortunately, thanks to the fasten seatbelt signs and the crew's instructions to remain seated, no one on board was hurt. After a quick assessment, the captain decided to continue the flight to San Francisco. Upon arrival in San Francisco, the incident was not immediately reported to aviation authorities, as there were no injuries or visible damage to the aircraft. However, 2 months later, the incident gained attention in the media, prompting a full investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, the Airline Pilots Association, and the Federal Aviation Administration. Unfortunately, by this time, the cockpit voice recorder had already overwritten the data from the flight, so investigators relied on data from the aircraft's flight systems, pilot interviews, passengers' accounts of the events, and available quick access recorder information to reconstruct the sequence of events, which limited how much they could have discovered. Nevertheless, the investigation highlighted several factors that had contributed to the incident. The primary cause was identified as a miscommunication between the captain and first officer about the flap setting. When the captain called for flaps 5, the first officer mistakenly set them to flaps 15, interrupting the intended flap retraction sequence. This discrepancy went unnoticed as the pilots solely focused on scaling through the turbulent weather. Additionally, investigators noted the challenges presented by the transition from Airbus to Boeing for the captain, who may have instinctively reacted to Boeing's controls as he would have in an Airbus, where pitch stability is managed differently. This difference in handling may have further complicated the response to the overspeed and pitch issues. As a result of these findings, United Airlines took proactive measures. The airline updated its training modules to emphasize the importance of clear communication in the cockpit, especially during critical phases of flight. The changes included an internal awareness campaign on flight path management and adherence to standard operating procedures, reinforcing the need for precise, mutual understanding between crew members. The 2 pilots are now receiving additional training as instructed by the Federal Aviation Administration. So, There you have it, the story of the two pilots who confronted death just a few seconds after takeoff. Thank you for watching, and if you found this story as captivating as we did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for even more exciting stories like this one. Bye for now, and see you in the next one.